The scene begins with a moment that should have been one of ease and quiet confidence. He walked into the VIP section with the certainty of someone who had not only earned the right to be there, but had surpassed the standards many times over. Everything about him reflected dignity, his posture, his attire, the calm assurance in his stride. Yet, instead of being acknowledged, instead of being treated with the respect that should have come naturally, he was met with suspicion and judgment. The staff members exchanged glances, whispers echoed in the air, and before long the decision was made to strip him of what was rightfully his. They removed him from the seat he had chosen, the seat he had paid for, the seat that symbolized not just privilege, but recognition of status. In that instant, the sting of humiliation was sharp and unforgettable. The humiliation was not simply about being asked to leave. It was about the way it was done. There was no polite request, no attempt to mask the disdain dripping from their words. The tone was sharp, commanding, and laced with the assumption that he did not belong, that he had wandered into a space that was not meant for someone like him. Around him, eyes followed, some filled with curiosity, others with silent approval, and a few with hidden pity. It wasn't just a removal. It was a public display of exclusion, a deliberate attempt to remind him of where they thought his place should be. For those watching, it might have seemed like a small incident, but for him, every second carved itself into memory. In that moment, the weight of history pressed down. This was not just about a seat in a VIP section. It was about centuries of people being told they didn't belong, about doors slammed shut in the faces of those who had every right to walk through them. It was about the audacity of prejudice that continued to thrive, even in spaces that prided themselves on modernity and equality. The humiliation became bigger than the man himself. It carried with it the echoes of others who had faced the same condescension, the same dismissal, the same stripping away of dignity in public view. Yet, what made this humiliation more piercing was the knowledge of his true identity. He was not a man struggling for recognition, not a man begging for access. He was someone whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of that exclusive section. The irony was bitter. The very people who pushed him out were, in ways they could not imagine, beneath the reach of his power. But at that point, they didn't know. They only saw what they wanted to see, and that narrow vision blinded them to the reality of who stood before them. As he stood there, removed from his seat, he could feel the burn of every stare. His pride was not wounded because of the material loss. It was wounded because of the insult to his humanity. Being denied access to a chair was trivial. Being denied respect was not. That was the wound they inflicted, a wound that would not heal easily. And as he processed the sting, he remained composed, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He stood tall, silent, with an expression that betrayed nothing. But inside, the fire had already begun to burn. The removal became a test of patience, a test of character, and above all, a test of restraint. Where others might have lashed out in anger, he chose to let the moment stretch, to absorb every detail, every word, every look. Because humiliation, when endured by the wrong person, has a way of turning into fuel. And in his case, the fuel was already gathering force. The injustice had created a crack in the surface of calm, and through that crack, the storm was beginning to rise. Humiliation in public is different from private insult. In private, words can be ignored, moments can be dismissed, and pride can be protected. But in public, the wound is laid bare for all to witness. It is not just the person being humiliated who feels the sting, but also the image of that person in the minds of everyone present. They had not only tried to strip him of his dignity in his own eyes, but they had attempted to redefine him in the eyes of others. That was their mistake. They thought they could shrink him in the gaze of the crowd, not realizing that their actions were instead magnifying the injustice for all to see. In the silence that followed his removal, whispers traveled. People asked questions, some even questioned the fairness of the act, but the damage had been done. The humiliation was complete, raw, and unforgettable. They thought they had asserted control. They thought they had reminded him of invisible lines he should not cross. They thought they had reduced him to nothing more than an intruder in a place meant for the privileged few. What they failed to see was that they had instead set into motion something far greater than the small satisfaction of excluding a man from a seat. The removal from VIP was more than a physical displacement. It was an attempt at erasure, a declaration that his presence was unworthy. But humiliation, when endured in silence, gathers its own strength. Each moment of that removal, each cold glance, each dismissive gesture, each word laced with superiority, etched itself into his mind. They had given him something far more valuable than access to a seat. They had given him the reason to strike back, the reason to plan, the reason to ensure that what began as their attempt to belittle him would end as their greatest regret. They looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see. To them, he was just another face, just another man who couldn't possibly belong in the place he had walked into with quiet confidence. Their eyes did not search for who he truly was, nor did they pause to consider that the person they dismissed might be someone far beyond their imagination. Instead, they reduced him to their narrow assumptions, painting a picture of inferiority without knowing the story behind the man they had chosen to insult. This was not just ignorance. It was arrogance, the kind that blinds people to the reality that greatness often wears no obvious crown. The underestimation was instant and deliberate. The staff members, the onlookers, and even those who silently watched his removal all believed the same thing: that he was out of place, that he had no right to be there, that he must have stumbled into the wrong world. What fueled their decision was not evidence, not truth, but the arrogance of their bias. They measured him not by his achievements, not by his wealth, not by his position, but by the shallow lens of appearance and assumption. In their eyes, he was less, and because they believed he was less, they acted as though stripping him of dignity was justified. But what they did not know was that behind the calm demeanor they dismissed so easily was a man who carried more power than any of them could imagine. He was not just a guest in that space. He was a figure who could alter the fate of those who thought themselves untouchable. He was a leader, a builder, someone who had shaped his own empire from the ground up. He was a man who had broken barriers, conquered challenges, and risen to heights that most of them could only dream of reaching. The irony was bitter. While they worked to guard access to a seat in a VIP section, he controlled boardrooms, shaped markets, and commanded influence that stretched far beyond the walls of that room. Their underestimation revealed a truth that repeated itself throughout history. Those who appear ordinary to the blind eye are often extraordinary when their true selves are revealed. The staff could not imagine that the man they treated like an intruder was a CEO, a leader whose name carried weight across industries. They could not imagine that the one they tried to push aside was wealthier, more influential, and more powerful than anyone else seated in that section. The act of underestimating him became their greatest mistake, for it set the stage for a revenge that would not come with anger or chaos, but with precision, dignity, and the full weight of the power they failed to see. In the moments after his removal, he could feel the sting of their assumptions. It wasn't just that they didn't recognize him. It was that they didn't even consider the possibility that he might be someone of significance. That was the essence of their arrogance. They believed they knew enough by glancing at him, by hearing his voice, by seeing the calm way he carried himself. They thought they had summed up his entire existence in a second, and that assumption gave them the false confidence to treat him with disdain. Yet, all the while he knew the truth. He knew that his silence was not weakness, that his calm was not surrender, that their laughter and whispers were only temporary illusions of power. The underestimation also revealed their fear. For people who cling so desperately to their fragile authority, it is easier to assume others are beneath them than to confront the possibility that they are in the presence of someone greater. By underestimating him, they gave themselves permission to mistreat him. It was not just ignorance. It was self-protection, a way of shielding themselves from the uncomfortable truth that power does not always wear the face they expect. They thought they were protecting the exclusivity of the space, but in reality, they were exposing the smallness of their own vision. Every glance, every dismissive word, every arrogant gesture became fuel. They thought they had reduced him to nothing, but instead, they handed him the very weapon he needed: the sweet advantage of being underestimated. When people assume you are powerless, they let their guard down. They reveal themselves fully, without caution, because they do not see you as a threat. That is exactly what they did. By underestimating him, they showed their arrogance in its rawest form. They revealed their prejudice openly, believing it would have no consequences. But he knew otherwise. He knew that being underestimated was not a weakness, It was a position of strength. It meant he could plan, he could calculate, and he could deliver his response with a precision that would leave them shattered. The truth about underestimation is that it often precedes the most powerful acts of revenge. History is filled with stories of individuals who were dismissed, overlooked, and pushed aside, only to rise with a force that could not be ignored. In this case, the pattern repeated itself. The more they dismissed him, the stronger his resolve grew. The more they assumed he was nothing, the more determined he became to show them he was everything they could never be. They thought they knew who he was. They thought they had defined his limits. They thought they had placed him in a box that could not be broken. But their failure was simple. They judged by appearances, and appearances deceived them. In their haste to remind him of what they believed his place should be, they forgot that true power is often quiet, invisible to the untrained eye, and far greater than the shallow symbols of exclusivity they tried so desperately to protect. When they removed him from the seat, when they stripped him of the dignity that came with belonging in that space, he did not lash out. He did not argue, shout, or demand recognition. Instead, he stood in silence, and with that silence came a sharpness far more dangerous than any outburst could have been. He observed, quietly, attentively, letting each moment etch itself into memory. The way their eyes narrowed in judgment, the smirk of satisfaction on the attendant's face, the condescending tone of authority in their voices. Every detail became part of the story he was writing in his mind. They thought silence meant surrender, but in reality, silence was his weapon. It gave him clarity, it gave him control, and it gave him the ability to see them more clearly than they saw him. The power of observation is often underestimated. In heated moments, when emotions run high, people reveal who they truly are. And as they humiliated him, they revealed themselves fully. They revealed their prejudice, their arrogance, and their false sense of superiority. They believed they had stripped him of pride, but what they had really done was expose the smallness of their own character. As he stood there, quietly watching, he was not simply enduring humiliation. He was collecting evidence, collecting fuel, and preparing the stage for what was to come. Every smirk, every dismissive glance, every whisper behind his back would become a thread woven into the fabric of his revenge. His silence unsettled some of those present. They had expected outrage, perhaps a scene that would justify their decision to remove him. But instead, they were faced with composure. There is something unsettling about a man who does not react in anger when provoked. His calmness became a mirror, reflecting their cruelty back at them. He knew that reacting immediately would give them power. He knew that showing anger would allow them to label him as disruptive or unworthy. So, he observed, storing away the memory of every insult, while keeping his dignity intact. As he watched, he also noticed the others around him. Not everyone approved of what had been done. There were people in the crowd whose eyes softened with unease, people who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to speak, but unwilling to celebrate his humiliation either. He saw them too. He noticed how the injustice had created a divide in the room, how some reveled in it, while others shrank from it. And this awareness gave him insight, not only into those who wronged him, but also into those who stood silently complicit. He understood that revenge would not only target the few who acted, but would ripple outward, shaking everyone who witnessed the injustice unfold. Observation gave him patience. He understood that revenge delivered in haste often loses its sharpness. By choosing silence, by choosing to watch and wait, he gave himself time to shape his response into something unforgettable. He knew that when the moment came, it would not be loud anger but quiet revelation that would dismantle their arrogance. Silence became his strategy, and observation became his strength. Where others might have burned with rage, he let the fire simmer, knowing that slow-burning flames consume everything in their path. As he observed, he also reflected on the irony of the moment. Here he was, a man of immense power, treated as though he were nothing. Here he was, a leader whose name carried weight in boardrooms and corridors of influence, stripped of dignity by people who had no idea of his true identity. The humiliation was sharp, but the irony made it even sharper. They were blind to who he was, and in that blindness, they gave him the greatest advantage a man of power could have, the chance to strike when no one expected it. Every second of that humiliation became a lesson in restraint. His silence was not weakness, but discipline. His observation was not passivity, but strategy. He understood that revenge is most devastating when it is unexpected, when it comes from the very person believed to be powerless. And so he stood there, silently studying the faces of those who had wronged him, silently shaping the contours of the storm that was forming within him. The truth about humiliation is that it often pushes people into rash action. But for him, it did the opposite. It sharpened his focus, it steadied his mind, and it reminded him of the power of patience. By observing, he saw not just what they did, but who they truly were. He saw their arrogance, their false sense of control, and their blindness to his true power. And with every observation, his resolve grew stronger. They thought they had silenced him. They thought his quiet acceptance of humiliation was proof of weakness. But in reality, his silence was the calm before the storm. His observation was the gathering of strength, the steady building of a response that would come not in words but in actions. They had mistaken patience for defeat, and in doing so, they had unknowingly handed him the upper hand. Because a man who observes quietly, who studies every detail without reaction, is a man preparing for a response that will leave no room for escape. Revenge, when born from humiliation, rarely arrives without thought. It does not rush in recklessly. It waits, sharpens itself, and takes shape with precision. For him, the moment of his removal from the VIP section was not just an insult to his dignity. It was the spark that ignited a deliberate plan. He knew that anger in the moment would serve no purpose. Words thrown in rage would scatter like ashes, forgotten as quickly as they were spoken. What he needed was something lasting, something that would not only reclaim his dignity, but leave a mark so deep that those who disrespected him would never forget the cost of their arrogance. And so, the plan began to form, not in fury, but in cold, calculated silence. The first part of his calculation came from knowing his own power. They underestimated him because they had no idea of who he really was. He knew this ignorance gave him the greatest advantage. They believed him to be powerless, insignificant, an intruder in a space not meant for him. He understood that when people lower their guard around you, when they see you as nothing, they reveal themselves fully. He had seen their arrogance, their prejudice, their smallness, and he knew how to use it against them. The plan would not be immediate retaliation, but something that would unravel slowly, catching them unprepared, exposing their error in front of the same audience that had once witnessed his humiliation. Patience became his ally. He allowed time to pass, giving them space to feel victorious in their cruelty. They walked away from the incident believing they had reduced him, believing they had won. But while they celebrated their false triumph, he was calculating. Every insult was measured, every smirk recorded, every word weighed. His mind worked like a craftsman shaping a weapon, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, ensuring that when it was finally revealed, it would cut with precision. His plan was not just to respond, but to transform the tables so completely that those who laughed at him would later struggle to meet his gaze. The beauty of calculated revenge lies in its subtlety. He did not need to shout. He did not need to make declarations. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, using his influence and power in ways invisible to those who had wronged him. Quietly, he ensured that when the truth of his identity was revealed, it would not just be a revelation, it would be a reckoning. He knew the impact would be greater if they discovered it not from him, but from circumstances beyond their control. They had mocked him in front of a crowd, and now, that same crowd would witness their downfall when the truth surfaced. Revenge for him was not about anger, but about restoration. He wanted to reclaim the dignity they had tried to strip away, but not by stooping to their level. His plan was designed to show the contrast between who they thought he was and who he truly was. It was not simply about punishing them. It was about teaching them a lesson so sharp that it would echo far beyond that single moment. His revenge would become a story, whispered and retold, an example of how arrogance blinds and underestimation destroys. Every calculated step was part of a larger vision. He ensured that his response would not only target those who insulted him, but would ripple outward, reaching everyone complicit in their silence. He understood that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of participation. Those who had watched and said nothing, those who had shrugged and looked away, would also be forced to reflect when the tables turned. His revenge was crafted not only for the guilty few, but for the entire system that allowed such humiliation to thrive. The calm way he carried himself after the incident was itself part of the calculation. By refusing to react in the moment, he denied them the satisfaction of labeling him as disruptive or unworthy. Instead, he carried his silence like a shield, hiding the storm building within. They thought his silence meant defeat, but it was the silence of strategy, of a man waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had exposed themselves, and now he simply had to choose the time and place to unveil the truth. In shaping his revenge, he thought carefully about impact. Words could be forgotten, but actions carried weight. His plan had to be so powerful that it not only reversed the humiliation, but redefined the entire narrative. Where once he had been seen as an outsider, he would now be recognized as the one with the ultimate authority. His revenge would not come in private. It would come in public, where the humiliation had begun, ensuring that the memory of their arrogance would forever be tied to the moment of their downfall. Calculated revenge is not about speed, it is about precision. He sharpened his silence into strategy, turning patience into a weapon. While they believed the story was over, he was just beginning to write its second half. And when the time came, when the plan unfolded, it would not be a loud explosion of anger, but a quiet, devastating revelation that shifted the balance of power completely. They had underestimated him once, and that underestimation was about to become the very tool he would use to change everything. The moment of revelation is unlike any other. It is not simply about showing power or proving a point. It is about overturning assumptions and rewriting the narrative that others thought they controlled. In his case, the revelation of his true identity was the climax of every slight, every whispered insult, every dismissive gesture that had come before. They had treated him as though he were ordinary, as though he were insignificant, and in doing so, they had set the stage for a revelation that would not only shock them, but leave a permanent mark on their perception of him. This was not about revenge for the sake of anger. It was about demonstrating the vast distance between who they thought he was and the reality they had ignored. As he revealed his true power, the room shifted. Faces that had once smirked with confidence now froze with disbelief. The whispers of judgment were replaced with murmurs of astonishment, and the same crowd that had silently watched his humiliation now watched as he reclaimed authority with quiet, unassailable strength. The contrast was striking. The same man who had been dismissed, who had been pushed aside, now commanded attention and respect without demanding it. His presence alone reshaped the atmosphere, reminding everyone that the assumptions made in haste often lead to profound misjudgments. The power of this revelation lay in its timing. He did not announce himself in the moment of conflict. He did not respond while the heat of anger could distort perception. Instead, he waited until the impact would be undeniable, until the truth could no longer be ignored, and until those who had wronged him would see, in undeniable clarity, the error of their judgment. Timing, in acts of revelation, is everything. Deliver it too soon, and it may be dismissed. Deliver it too late, and it may lose its potency. But when executed with precision, it carries a weight that lingers, reshaping relationships, perceptions, and even self-awareness among those who had underestimated him. The shock of recognition is powerful because it forces people to confront reality. Those who had assumed they were in control suddenly realized they had been blind. They had judged him superficially, relying on appearances and assumptions rather than seeking truth. They had laughed, dismissed, and humiliated, never imagining that the man they treated as lesser was someone whose influence extended far beyond their understanding. The revelation did more than correct a misjudgment. It exposed the arrogance and small-mindedness of those who had acted without insight. In revealing his true identity, he also reclaimed the narrative. Previously, the story was theirs to control. They had defined him as an outsider, a man who did not belong, a target of casual disrespect. But with the revelation, the story shifted entirely. The power to define him moved from their hands to his own. He no longer existed as a passive character in their judgment. He became the author of the narrative. The room that had once seemed a stage for his humiliation was now a stage for the demonstration of his authority, intelligence, and influence. Every gesture, every word, every look conveyed the truth they had ignored, that he was a man of power, dignity, and consequence. The revelation also served as a lesson in humility. Those who had dismissed him could no longer rely on assumptions. They were forced to reassess their judgments, to acknowledge the limits of perception, and to confront the consequences of underestimating someone based on superficial criteria. In witnessing his power, they were reminded that appearances are often deceptive, that influence can be hidden behind quiet composure, and that true authority does not always announce itself until the moment of revelation. It was not just a personal victory. It was a universal lesson about the danger of prejudice and the consequences of arrogance. What made the revelation even more effective was its subtlety. He did not seek to humiliate them in return with overt displays of dominance. Instead, he allowed the contrast to speak for itself. His composure, his confidence, and the undeniable facts of his identity created a natural, almost inevitable, recognition of the imbalance they had caused. This subtlety amplified the impact because it left no room for denial. The evidence of his authority, his power, and his rightful place was visible to all, and their attempts to justify their prior actions crumbled in the face of truth. Revelation, in its purest form, transforms perception. It forces people to reconcile their assumptions with reality, and it demonstrates the cost of misjudgment in ways that are immediate and unforgettable. In his case, the revelation was not just about power. It was about dignity, respect, and the restoration of balance. Those who had acted without insight were compelled to see him as he truly was, a leader, a figure of influence, and a man whose presence could not be diminished by ignorance or prejudice. As the realization sank in, the atmosphere changed entirely. The arrogance and condescension that had filled the air moments before dissipated, replaced by awe, respect, and a subtle tension born of recognition. He had turned the moment of humiliation into a moment of authority, the moment of disrespect into a moment of validation. In doing so, he demonstrated that true power is not always about immediate retaliation. It is about timing, strategy, and the ability to reveal one's true self in a way that cannot be ignored. The revelation also carried with it an unspoken warning. Those who had dismissed him now understood the consequences of underestimation. They had assumed that power was visible only in loud displays, that status was defined by appearances, and that influence could be measured by proximity rather than achievement. Their assumptions had been shattered, and in that shattering, he had asserted not just his identity, but the undeniable truth that misjudgment carries consequences, and that the quiet strength of a man underestimated can reshape the entire landscape of perception and control. Transformation is rarely immediate. It is not something that happens in a single moment of triumph, nor is it merely the result of a single act of revenge. In his case, the experience of being removed from the VIP section, the humiliation, and the subsequent revelation of his identity became catalysts for a profound transformation, both for himself and for those around him. What had begun as an insult evolved into an opportunity to redefine boundaries, to shift perceptions, and to turn a moment of disrespect into a powerful demonstration of resilience and authority. Transformation, in this sense, was not just personal. It was systemic, reshaping the way people would perceive him and those like him long after the event had passed. The transformation began with his response. Many would have reacted in anger, defensively, or with despair. He did none of these. Instead, he chose strategy over impulse, patience over haste, and composure over reaction. In doing so, he transformed the narrative. He transformed himself from a passive victim of circumstances into an active agent of change. Every calculated move, every silent observation, every measured step in his plan was part of this metamorphosis. He became a man whose dignity could not be stripped, whose power could not be denied, and whose presence could not be ignored. What had started as a moment of weakness, in the eyes of others, became a moment of strength and opportunity. The transformation also affected those who had underestimated him. They had believed themselves in control, believing that the humiliation they inflicted would remain unchallenged. But as the truth of his identity emerged and his quiet revenge unfolded, they were forced to confront their own misjudgments. Their perception of him, and perhaps of the world around them, shifted. What they once saw as an ordinary individual they could dismiss became a figure of authority whose influence could not be ignored. Transformation, in this sense, operates both ways. It is the reshaping of the self, but also the reshaping of others' understanding, forcing them to reconsider their assumptions and their behavior. Part of the transformation lay in the way he reclaimed power. The act of being removed from VIP had been designed to diminish him, but through careful planning and execution, he transformed the situation into one where he held all the leverage. The humiliation they intended became the groundwork for a display of competence, intelligence, and authority so undeniable that it reversed the balance of power. What had been a setback became the very tool that allowed him to assert dominance, proving that true authority is not always about confrontation, but about the strategic use of opportunity. Transformation also carries an element of permanence. Whereas revenge might fade, and humiliation might linger only as a bitter memory, transformation leaves an enduring mark. By turning disrespect into a platform for demonstrating his true value, he ensured that his influence would extend beyond the immediate moment. The lessons embedded in this transformation were subtle yet powerful. Arrogance has consequences, underestimation is dangerous, and dignity paired with strategy is unstoppable. Those who witnessed the change could not unsee it, and the ripples of his transformation would extend into future interactions, affecting how he was treated, respected, and regarded in ways that no single act of retaliation could have achieved. The process of transformation also reinforced his own identity. Humiliation has a unique power to challenge self-perception, to create doubt where confidence once stood. But by carefully observing, calculating, and executing a plan of response, he reinforced his own understanding of who he was and what he was capable of. Each step of the process, the patience, the strategy, the revelation, served as a mirror, reflecting back the strength, intelligence, and resilience he possessed. In transforming the perception of others, he simultaneously transformed his own self-perception, turning a moment of vulnerability into one of empowerment. Transformation is rarely linear. There are moments of doubt, moments where patience feels impossible, moments when the weight of humiliation threatens to overwhelm. Yet, he navigated each stage with deliberate care, understanding that the true measure of change lies not in impulsive action, but in sustained, thoughtful response. The small, deliberate choices he made, holding back anger, observing carefully, planning quietly, were the scaffolding on which the larger transformation was built. What seemed like restraint to outsiders was in fact the strategic cultivation of power and influence that would manifest at the perfect moment. Another aspect of transformation lies in its visibility. The shift from being underestimated and dismissed to commanding respect and authority is not always subtle. In his case, the transformation was unmistakable, visible not just in his demeanor, but in the reactions of those around him. Their shock, their astonishment, their reevaluation of him served as confirmation of the change that had taken place. Transformation was no longer an internal process. It had become an external reality, one that others could see, feel, and experience. Finally, transformation is enduring because it changes expectations. Those who had once assumed they knew who he was could no longer rely on assumptions. The rules of engagement had shifted. The humiliation that had once seemed to define him had instead become a defining moment of strength, strategy, and resilience. In that transformation, he not only reclaimed his dignity, but also reshaped the social landscape around him, ensuring that his influence, respect, and authority were recognized in ways that extended far beyond the initial moment of insult. Through this transformation, the insult that began as a removal from a seat became a story of triumph, a demonstration of intelligence, patience, and strategic power. It was proof that moments designed to diminish can be repurposed to elevate, that humiliation can serve as a catalyst for growth, and that revenge, when paired with strategy and foresight, can result in transformation that resonates far beyond a single encounter. In reshaping perception, reclaiming power, and asserting his identity, he turned a moment of disrespect into a lasting legacy, showing that true transformation is not only about restoring what was lost, but about creating something far greater than what existed before.